Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hugh Lane Gallery's Coffee Conversation series. Today is Wednesday, the 11th of August, 2021, and I'm here today to talk to you about Alexander Calder. The artwork that we'll be looking at for today's conversation is Sun and Moon by Alexander Calder, and it was a later work of the artist produced in 1972 when he was 74 years old, just 4 years before he passed away. At just over a meter wide and about 3/4 of a meter high, it's quite a large work, and it's one of several similar gouaches produced by the artist around the same time in the 1970s. However, this is perhaps not exactly the type of work that Calder is most well known for, though the ideas, influences, and inspiration behind it are in line with some of the same philosophies that guided the artist throughout his life. Before we delve more into the specifics of this painting, though, let's take a brief look at the artist's early years, his journey with, away from, and ultimately back to artistic practice. Known as Sandy by his friends and family, Alexander Calder was born in 1898 in a suburb near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and he was the fourth generation of sculptors in his family. His grandfather, Alexander Milne Calder, is known for a monumental statue of William Penn on Philadelphia City Hall's tower. His father, Alexander Sterling Calder, also has many sculptural installations throughout Philadelphia where he grew up, as well as a nude sculpture of a 3-year-old Alexander Calder, the man cub, which you're currently looking at on the left-hand side of your screen. This sculpture was likely a reference to the character of Mowgli in Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, which was first published in 1894, just 7 years before this sculpture was created. Calder's mother, Nanette, was also an artist whose primary medium was in painting. She was a professional portrait artist who had studied at the Académie Julienne, like many of the female artists in the gallery's collection, and she went on to study at the Sorbonne from 1888 to 1893 before meeting Alexander Sterling Calder in Philadelphia, where she'd moved to continue her artistic studies. Both of Calder's parents encouraged his creativity from an early age, and in fact, Alexander Calder made his first sculpture in 1902 at the age of only 4 years old. It was a clay elephant. Calder's first studio, however, was in Pasadena, California, also at a young age, where the family had relocated after Alexander Sterling Calder, his father, had contracted tuberculosis. So they moved from Pennsylvania to have a warmer climate so that he could perhaps speed up his recovery. This is also where the young Alexander Calder received his first set of tools, which he employed to make jewelry for his sister's dolls from scraps of copper wire. Around 1909, the family moved again to Croton-on-Hudson, New York, and this is significant in that Christmas, Alexander Calder, again still quite young at this time, he would have been about 11, made sculptures of a dog and a duck out of sheets of brass for his parents as gifts, and that's what you're looking at in the upper right side of your screen there. And notably, the duck sculpture that you can see there would rock when it was gently tapped. So even at 11 years old, we can see that the young Calder is already beginning to play with the idea of kinetics that would later inform his mature practice. Because of various artistic commissions that the elder Calder, his father, received, Alexander Calder's high school years were spent between New York and California, but no matter where they were living, Calder's parents always reserved cellar space for the young artist's studio. Nevertheless, following his high school graduations, Alexander decided not to immediately pursue art making, but rather to pursue a degree in engineering. He didn't return to art until 1922. This engineer's mind, though, that seems to have been a dominant aspect of the artist's personality from an early age, is present in Calder's mature work as well, especially in the balance and kinetic energy of his mobiles, his jewelry, and his wire sculptures. In college, Calder studied mechanical engineering at the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. Here, he excelled in maths, again likely due to his natural predilection for the mechanics and precision of engineering and its methods. In his college yearbook, Calder was described as follows: "Sandy is evidently always happy, or perhaps up to some joke, for his face is always wrapped up in that same mischievous, juvenile grin. This is certainly the index of the man's character in this case, for he is one of the best-natured fellows there is." So it seems that Calder enjoyed and excelled in his chosen field of study then, and though he would ultimately return to art making, it is this technical background that allowed the artist to innovate in the ways that he did, and indeed to completely alter the medium of sculpture from the 1930s onwards. Calder received his degree in 1919 and held many jobs in his field before returning to art making. These jobs included being a hydraulic engineer and draftsman for the New York Edison Company, which again we might infer would later influence his artistic innovations, especially in the field of sculpture. So what you're looking at on the screen now is just some examples of these of Calder's kinetic sculptures and this influence of engineering that I think he would have honed while in school that later came to apply in his work. And just to say that the video on the right is actually, it's a video of Calder's grandson activating one of Calder's wire sculptures. It was a 1936 work called Tightrope. As I mentioned, though, 1922, just 3 years after Calder received his engineering degree, was a fateful year for the artist, in that, according to his own account of his personal history, there is a key moment of his life that occurred here, a turning point that encouraged him to once again embrace art making. So based off the elements of its composition, sun and moon, which of course is the topic of today's conversation, could be interpreted as an allegory for this significant moment in Calder's life. So we'll look at it as a means of sort of telling this story. The event happened while Calder was on a voyage from New York City to San Francisco via the Panama Canal. He was working aboard the ship the H.F. Alexander as a mechanic, and on this journey he had an inspirational vision in which he awoke from a nap on a ship's deck to witness on opposite horizons a large red sun and bright silver moon sharing the sky. As Calder tells it in his autobiography, "It was early one morning on a calm sea off Guatemala when my couch, a coil of rope, I saw the beginning of a fiery red sunrise on one side and the moon looking over like a silver coin on the other." So if we look at the painting, Sun and Moon, we can see that this is sort of symbolically being depicted here, or at least we could interpret it that way, with the sun in the lower left corner and the spiral shape symbolizing the moon in the upper right, and how these are sharing the same sky while the moon is setting and the sun is rising. Inspired by this vision on the H.F. Alexander voyage, then, when Calder disembarked in San Francisco, he traveled to Aberdeen, Washington, where he visited his sister and her husband, Kenneth Hayes. Here, he was inspired by the mountainous landscape of the area to begin painting again. So shortly after that visit, Calder decided to move back to New York and pursue a career as an artist. He enrolled in classes at the Art Students League and picked up work sketching for the National Police Gazette, a popular men's lifestyle magazine of the time, which we're looking at an example of here. One of his assignments for the National Police Gazette was sketching Barnum and Bailey's circus, which sparked a renewed fascination with the action and spectacle of the big top performances. It was during this time as well that Calder learned the technique of drawing in a single continuous line from his classes at the Art Students League, which we also refer to as contour drawing sometimes. Many of these types of drawings feature in Police Gazette, which again we're currently looking at one example of here, including the circus drawings that Calder made while observing the Barnum Ringling Circus in New York in 1925. From this experience, Calder maintained a printmaking practice, continuing to produce illustrations for books and journals throughout his career. The circus had actually been a familiar source of inspiration throughout Calder's life from an early age. This began in 1907 when his mother took him to the Tournament of Roses parade while the family was living in Pasadena, California. Here, he observed a 4-horse chariot race that was influential on his later decision to have this type of event as the finale of his miniature circus, which we are looking at a video of currently. So just to speak a little bit about this circus, which was known as Cirque Calder, it began following a move to Paris in 1926, which Calder decided to do following his time in New York. In Paris, he enrolled in the Académie de la Grande Chaumière and began making mechanical toys, another nod to his engineering degree perhaps, and this is where he developed Cirque Calder. So early on during his Paris period, Calder made money as a street performer with this miniature circus show, which was made up of tiny figurines fashioned from wire, cloth, string, rubber, cork, and really any other found objects that the artist came across. In total, the circus consisted of an elaborate troupe of over 70 miniature figures and animals nearly 100 accessories such as nets, flags, carpets, and lamps, and over 30 musical instruments, phonographic records, and noisemakers. So really almost the entire scale of a circus just in miniature. It was designed to be transportable, and at its largest it filled 5 large suitcases. As you can see from the video, Cirque Calder exemplifies the playful wit that is infused in much of the artist's work that I think we saw early on in his childhood, which sort of continued and was infused in the artist's practice throughout his career. Cirque Calder was presented on both sides of the Atlantic and was particularly popular with the Parisian avant-garde. During the Parisian performances, Calder's audience would sit on a low bed or on crates, munching on peanuts, much the way that you would do in the circus, and using noisemakers while Calder choreographed, directed, and performed Calder's circus, narrating the actions both in English or in French. It was accompanied by music and lighting, and the performances could last as long as 2 hours. A practice that Calder established and honed in this work, as well as the concept of wire sculpture or drawing in space, which is something that he's credited with inventing. So he was the first person to do this, and he sort of begun this practice of using wire sculpture as a means of drawing in space from Cirque Calder, his miniature circus. He was an innovator from the beginning, and Cirque Calder is one of the earliest modern works in which we also see that the artist is equally involved as maker and performer. So we see the beginnings of these sort of modern ideas of performance art and changing the idea of what art is itself and the practice of the artist and all of that. Calder gained attention for his work in Paris in the 1920s and was quickly embraced and championed by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In Paris, Calder also became friends with avant-garde artists like Fernand Léger, Jean Arp, and Marcel Duchamp. So it seems he established himself with relative ease here, a privilege that would have likely been quite attainable for a man of his talent as well as his upbringing and background, because remember, he came from a long sort of established artistic family. Regardless, in June 1929, another significant event happened while he was traveling by boat from Paris back to New York, in that this is where Calder met his future wife, Louisa James, who was the grandniece of Henry James. So his time in Paris really was quite significant to the artist's life. And perhaps because of this, France would become a place that he would return to often and even later in his life. And I think up until the end of his life, he maintained homes and studios in France, though no longer in Paris. It was more in the countryside of France. Another key moment or turning point in the artist's career happened again in Paris in 1930 when Calder visited Piet Mondrian's studio. This visit purportedly shocked Calder into embracing abstract art, prompting a radical shift from an art of observing things in the world towards an art that opened up a world unto itself. From this point, when he moved into the realm of abstraction, Calder's prints began to reflect this new philosophy as they began to delineate groups of geometric shapes, often in motion, a feature that we see exemplified in Sun and Moon. Around this time, Calder also joined the Abstraction creation group, where he began creating sculpture with movable parts, for which his friend, the artist Marcel Duchamp, coined the term mobiles. Calder's early mobiles from say 1930 to 1932 were first made using motors, and perhaps this was an influence of his engineering degree as well as his early motorized toys that he created. But by 1932, he had begun to move away from this technique, from using the motors that characterized the motion of his early mobiles, as he didn't like the prescribed type of motion that they gave to the works. Instead, he was looking for something a bit more organic, and so as a solution, Calder, ever the intuitive engineer, developed sculptures that moved as a response to natural phenomena like touch or air currents. And these are the mobiles that he's, I would say, most well known for today. So we're looking at 2 examples of these. On the left side of the screen, there is an earlier example from around 1931, and this is called Object with Red Discs. So this would be one of his earlier standing kinetic mobiles. While on the right, we're looking at a later mobile called Big Red from 1959, and this is one of his suspended mobiles that he became quite well known for. Also notably, according to the artist, these mobiles came from an inspiration to make moving Mondrians, so truly significant was his experience of visiting Piet Mondrian's studio in 1930, and it really sort of kind of informed his artistic practice moving forward. Though the forms and shapes of Calder's sculptures are also related to nature and the cosmos, and this was another lifelong inspiration of the artist that we're going to look at more closely in a little bit in relation to his drawings. So just to say that as an inspiration as well that came into the practice of making mobiles. Looking back at his drawing and painting practice, though, for his drawings, prints, and paintings, Calder preferred gouache and ink over oil paints, which he thought took too long to dry, as well as over traditional watercolors, which he thought were too transparent. So gouache or opaque watercolor and ink were really his preferred medium to work in, and he created several of these throughout his life. Again, though he's most well known for his kinetic sculptures, drawing and painting remained a significant part of Calder's artistic practice throughout his oeuvre. And in his homes in France, he even had specific areas set aside for painting, which he referred to as his gouacheries. Sun and Moon was painted in his gouacherie in Sachet, where, interestingly, it was his typical practice to work in artificial light. And I just say interestingly because it's a painting that refers to the cosmos and to the sun and moon, but he's working in symbols and in artificial light to create it. In Sun and Moon, then, we see a palette of bold primary colors that was typical to his gouaches and similar to the color palettes used by his friends Mondrian as well as Joan Miro. We see this palette as well as certain forms or symbols such as the spiral moon and flaming sun repeated across many of Calder's gouaches and prints throughout his lifetime, in fact. For example, in the lithograph that we're looking at on the left side of the screen, which was painted in 1946, nearly 30 years before Calder painted Sun and Moon, we see the familiar sun and moon symbols which continue to consistently reappear in his later works, pretty much up until the works he created just prior to his passing. The yin-yang, by contrast, though, I believe was added in a bit later, perhaps around the time that the symbol became popular in the 1960s and 1970s, which again I'll touch on in just a moment here. Though Calder did not go to pains to explain the philosophies and theories that infused his practice, these symbols and ideas about balance, be it graphic or kinetic, drawn or engineered, are present throughout the artist's work, regardless of the medium. As Calder once said, theories may all be very well for the artist himself, but they shouldn't be broadcast to other people. To me, Calder is saying here that one's artistic practice should be a personal journey, and that this journey should speak through the work itself, without the artist having to otherwise divulge their thoughts or processes. As Calder became more popular, the commercial aspect of his work increased in kind. First, when lithographs based on his gouache paintings were marketed from the 1940s and 1950s, and then later in 1972 when he was commissioned to create several gouache paintings as designs that were painted on planes for Braniff International Airways, which we see an example of here. I wanted to include an image of this aspect of Calder's oeuvre and speak about it briefly because in addition to it being an interesting and somewhat unique aspect of an artist's oeuvre, which signals just how popular and successful he had become, I also find it interesting how directly the same forms, colors, and symbols that Calder used regularly in his gouaches have translated onto this airplane design. We see again that Calder has included the sun symbol as part of his overall design for this plane, very appropriate for a vessel traveling through the skies. As well, I think that the more organic forms and shapes used here are particularly interesting in this instance, as they do have a sense of the lightness and kineticism of the gouaches, and this sense is physically activated here as they literally soar up into and through the atmosphere. Returning again to the primary subject of our conversation now, let's take a moment to look at the symbols and techniques of Sun and Moon before we wrap up. In an introduction for one of Calder's exhibitions, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "One of Calder's objects is like the sea, always beginning over again, always new." So sort of referring to this sort of kinetic, moving, balanced nature that we see in Calder's drawings, paintings, sculptures, and really throughout all of his work. The suspension of the different elements in their own geographic and primary colors in different sections in this gouache and their two-dimensional quality recalls for me the weightlessness of Calder's mobiles. We get this sort of sense of movement and lightness in response to the environment, even I think on this two-dimensional artwork. In a characteristic palette that's confined to red, yellow, black, and white, the sun and moon are boldly depicted here, separated by a diminishing row of yin and yang motifs recalling the forms of the universe. The spiral of the moon echoes Calder's jewelry and early wire figures, and we can see that it is a symbol that held significance for the artist as it is constantly repeated across his various works. Another quote from the artist's autobiography reads, "The underlying sense of form in my work has been the system of the universe, or part thereof. What I mean is that the idea of detached bodies floating in space, of different sizes and densities, perhaps of different colors and temperatures, and surrounded and interlarded with wisps of gaseous condition, and some at rest, while others move in particular manners, seems to me the ideal source of form." And again, I think this is something that we do see repeated throughout Calder's work in different ways. The movement here is certainly indicated in the inherent motion of the spiral, which has been used as a symbol of the moon since ancient times. One of the most familiar usages of this symbol to us might be the ancient Celtic symbol of the triple spiral, or triskele, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that. It's a tripartite symbol consisting of 3 interlocked spirals, which is associated with earthly life, afterlife, and reincarnation. We also see similar individual or clustered spiral markings on ancient sites like Newgrange, which has been hugely influential in many modern people's interpretations of spirals as symbols. Many people from studying Newgrange suggest that spirals are representative of the cycle of rebirth, especially as they're indicated by their presence at a tomb, or as a symbol of a mother goddess who in recent times has been strongly associated with underground chambers, which are interpreted as symbolic wombs. Whether or not the artist intended this layer of meaning, we could reasonably interpret the spiral symbol as a reference to Calder's rebirth as an artist following his vision aboard the HF Alexander, which again we could sort of infer that this could be describing in terms of the relation of the sun and the moon sharing equal space in the sky, and the balance that I think Calder read into that as an inspirational moment in his life. The spiral could also be a reference to intuition or following one's inner guide, which also I think directly speaks to Calder's description of his journey back to art making. The spiral can be a symbol of the universe, of our place within it, and of the great cycles that constantly advance within this universe, and that are mirrored, I think, in the cycles of our lives and the things that we choose to do with it. We also know from the artist's writing that he was continually inspired both by nature and the cosmos, so it should be noted as well that spirals are more commonly found in nature than straight-edged shapes, and he was likely inspired by this as well, whether consciously or subconsciously. In regards to the cosmos, some references that come to mind could be at play here are the existence of spiral galaxies, including our own Milky Way galaxy, which is of course a spiral galaxy, as well as the rotation of the Earth and other planets within the galaxy. Moving to the yin-yang symbols that seem to be spiraling directly across the center of the page now, we can just take a moment to look at that sort of symbolism as well. So traditionally, yin-yangs were a Taoist symbol of balance and of inner peace. And the forms that we're looking at here, which do not include the dots that we would typically expect to find in a yin-yang symbol, could also indicate that these could also be Taiji or Tai Chi symbols, which are related to the yin-yang and represent a supreme ultimate state of undifferentiated, absolute, and infinite potential, sort of the oneness before duality, the duality of which is, I think, represented in the yin-yang symbol. The Taiji symbol is also related to Tai Chi, which became popular in America in the 1970s following the popularity of Bruce Lee films. So this could have also been something that was sort of on Calder's radar that influenced him, since this was, of course, created in 1972. This sense of balance and potential directly related as well to what we know of the ideas and methods that are inherent in Calder's sculptures too. So in addition to the sense of lightness and movement that we get from the forms in this painting, the ideas and symbolism behind it also seem to align with the artist's guiding principles. And then finally, I would say as well, we have the sun symbol in the lower right corner, which we've already sort of discussed. It was kind of a recurring motif throughout Calder's work, and I would say is seen to kind of balance the more feminine symbolism of the moon, as the sun's often used as a masculine counterpart to that. And then this balance is also reflected in the balance of the shapes and the composition in the different sort of geometric areas that each shape and symbol is kind of confined within, as well as the the balance between the primary colors of red and yellow that we see included as well on the gouache. In addition to what I've discussed in today's conversation, Alexander Calder also created theater sets and costumes, prints, miniatures, tapestries, rugs, political posters, and all sorts of other kinds of artwork, which I'd encourage you to look up as well, as they're equally interesting to anything I've discussed today, really. Regardless of medium, it seems that overall Calder had a very zen approach to his art, and he even again stated once that others grasp what I have in mind seems unessential as long as they have something else in theirs. So more so than others, perhaps, Calder seems happy to relinquish interpretation of his artwork to the viewer, looking only to spark something, anything, any kind of idea within them. Perhaps he was simply confident in the inherent, almost primordial qualities of his work and its transcendent meaning, its direct connection with the manifestations of nature, suggesting the elemental systems that animate life itself. So that's all I have for you today. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone for tuning in. And for any updates on the gallery's programming, you can visit hughlanei.ie/education. Thanks.